The superannuation industry has been around for decades, yet there hasn't been a lot of innovation or changes throughout that time. However, there have been some exciting developments to the industry within the last few years that will help Australians grow their investment balances even more. This includes stricter regulations to punish underperforming super funds, more competition, and a general demand to reduce costs. With these factors in mind, a certain type of investment has been gaining more traction amongst super funds. In May of 2023, Aware Super released several new investment options. There was a high growth index option, which was a new passively managed low cost diversified option with a growth to defensive split of 88 to 12%. They also had a balanced version and a conservative version, which essentially just changed the splits between growth assets and defensive assets. Host Plus followed closely behind, releasing two new investment options in November of the same year called their indexed high growth and indexed defensive options. These investment types are obviously called indexed options, as the name suggests. And in this video, I'll briefly explain what indexed options are, why they're getting so popular, and at the end, I'll show you 3 key factors to help you decide which super fund to go for. So what are indexed options? Well, you can think of indexed options as following a recipe. Just like how a recipe has a list of ingredients, quantities, and instructions on how to make it, index options followed a recipe called an index. An index has a list of companies, how much to invest into each one, and instructions on how to follow the index. Following an index is referred to a passive management style as opposed to an active management style where the fund managers of a superannuation fund will attempt to use their skills to beat a particular index. So why are index options becoming more popular, you might ask? And why is everyone suddenly caring whether or not their investments are passively managed or actively managed? I mean, how big of a difference could it really make? As it turns out, it can end up being quite a lot. As I talked about in a prior video, the difference in fees between an active management style and a passive management style could compound to over $100,000 come retirement time. Funds that are actively managed charge more with the expectation that they can beat the market after cost. But this hasn't been the case for most active fund managers. In fact, 85% of active fund managers have underperformed the Australian market over the past 15 years. The use of passive management within superannuation is also supported by Australian academics, who even go so far as to say that passively managed funds should actually be the default option for all Australians. In a paper published by Queensland University of Technology, where they examined the asset allocation, returns, and expenses of superannuation funds between 2004 and 2012, it found that almost 2 in 3 superannuation funds failed to meet the benchmark returns of their default options. And this is explained partially by the strategic asset allocation chosen by the fund managers, essentially meaning that these funds underperformed because there was someone picking and choosing which stocks to invest into. In another academic paper by the same university, it found that the rational choice is for a low-cost, passively managed fund. Such a choice would significantly reduce the costs of superannuation and improve the returns available to contributors. So both of these papers lean towards the idea that a passive management style might be better. But suppose you're still not convinced, because you know for a fact that there have been funds out there that have outperformed the market. Perhaps it's a fund that you're currently with as well. And if you're currently not with one, then surely you can just pick a fund that's going to beat the market based on its previous performance, right? Well, just because a fund recently had good performance, even if they had good performance over a stretch of a decade, doesn't mean that that performance can persist into the future. Performance chasing often leads to poor results. And to further drive home the unreliability of past performance, when we look at the top 20 best performing US funds over the period of 1970 to 1980, we find that only one fund out of that top 20 remained in the top 20 over the next decade. If you had decided to pick the best performing fund between 1970 and 1980, over the next decade, they would have ranked at 176th. If you picked the second, they would have ranked 126th. And if you picked the third, then they would have came in at 186. So hopefully by now I've given you enough evidence for you to be convinced that perhaps a passive management style might be the best. And before we move on to the last part of the video, if you have found any value at all so far, it would mean a lot if you could hit that like button down below, because that really does help out the channel, and subscribe for more content in the future relating to superannuation. Okay, so now that we understand why index options have been gaining popularity over the past few years, let's talk about 3 different factors that you should be looking out for to help you choose between the top 5 superannuation funds that offer indexed options. So the first factor to consider are the fees. The table shown here shows a breakdown of all of the fees, including the account fees and investment fees of the super funds as of financial year 2023. And what you can expect to also be paying based on your given superannuation balance. Now, this comparison doesn't include insurance premiums for simplicity. This is because insurance in super can be complicated to compare. For the investment options, I'm comparing their index Australian and index international shares options, where the allocations are assumed to be 40% Australian and 60% international. Some of you looking at the table might be wondering how REST's investment fees are 0%. This is because rather than directly investing in the companies themselves, they actually indirectly get exposure to them by using derivative contracts that are managed by Macquarie Bank. Now, I won't go into the nitty-gritty details about these derivative contracts, but the main thing to call out is that there is a risk of Macquarie not actually fulfilling those derivative contracts, which is known as counterparty risk. Now, this would essentially only happen if Macquarie went insolvent, and what would happen is the investment might perform differently and then a management fee might be applied. Also, because derivatives are used, investors don't actually get any franking credits. However, when you invest through REST, they actually distribute the franking credits that they receive across all of their funds. So the effect on their indexed options are going to be less noticeable. The second factor to consider is what these indexed options are actually investing into. Although super funds will generally invest in the same companies, there are going to be some subtle differences between them because of the different indexes that these investments follow. The indexes that the super funds follow for their index options are shown here on the screen. Now, these index names probably won't make any sense to you, so here's a visualization of what these indexes invest into from each fund. For the Australian shares options, obviously you're going to get exposure to the Australian market. Now, some super funds do this by taking the top 200 companies like Hostplus and Q Super, whilst others take the top 300 Australian companies like Rest and Art. It may seem like taking the top 300 Australian companies would be better to be a bit more diversified. However, those extra 100 companies only really make up 5% of the total index. So the difference in long-term performance would probably be quite negligible. For the international shares option, you'll get exposure to large and mid-cap companies across 22 developed markets, including the US, UK, and Japan. For Q Super, their international shares option is actually 100% hedged against the Australian dollar to reduce the risk of currency fluctuations. However, this might not be desirable because it's been found that over the long term, currency fluctuations usually even out over time. And because you're hedging, it does come with extra costs. A good middle ground is to be partially hedged, which Art and Hostplus both offer. Now, something that only Art offers is the ability to invest into international small cap companies and emerging markets. Both of these markets combined almost make up a quarter of the globe, making the international shares option of Art the most diversified out of all of the super funds on this list. The last factor to consider is what kind of companies the super fund may be excluding. Super funds do this as a part of the sustainable investing plan, where they exclude companies that are perceived to be harmful to society or the environment. Since super funds have different exclusions, it's important to compare them them so that you can form your own decision as to which super fund aligns most closely to your own personal values. Aware Super has the most exclusions, where they exclude tobacco-related companies which derive their revenue from tobacco-related products, thermal coal companies, and companies that make any revenue from controversial weapons. ART and Q Super both exclude tobacco-related companies and controversial weapons, whilst Host Plus only excludes controversial weapons and Rest only excludes tobacco-related companies. Now, even though these funds have exclusions, there's typically a threshold that needs to be met before said company becomes excluded. So for example, with the exclusion of tobacco-related companies, that company must actually derive more than 5% of its gross revenue before it's actually excluded by any one of these funds. Meaning if a company made 4% of its gross revenue from tobacco-related products, then it wouldn't be excluded by any of these funds. So those are the 3 things that you should be looking out for when choosing between these 5 different super funds. Now, I know that people are going to be asking in the comments, well, out of these 5, which ones should I choose? And look, I really can't choose for you, but hopefully I've empowered you with the knowledge to help you in your own decision-making process. So hopefully I've provided you with some value in today's video. And if you're interested in seeing how you stack up against the average or median super balance in Australia, check out this video right here.